Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You remember Bill Black? He said the best way to rob a bank is to buy a bank, or therefore something like that. This is all going to make a lot of sense. Hold on. Hi, Stacy.
Well, for those who don't know, William K. Black was a special prosecutor during the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s when there was widespread fraud. Especially, there were a lot of Congress people involved and, some of the Bush family involved. And he said he put 1,800 bankers behind bars, and that set in motion the boom times that followed, where all the criminals were taken off the street, i.e. Wall Street. He said the best way to rob a bank is to own a bank, because therefore you get away with crimes. Here is crime in this headline because many people do associate with Mexico with the cartels and crime wave here. Curbing crime could boost Mexico's economic growth, says think tank. Cutting crime in Mexico could encourage more investment, leading to higher economic growth, a private sector think tank said last week. That is why it is indispensable to guarantee security, the private sector Center for Economic Studies said in its weekly report.
I don't get it, man. I mean, look at America. We know at J.P. Morgan, we know with Jamie Dimon, their business model is to keep 90 cents of every dollar they steal. They pay 10 cents of every dollar they steal as a fine. They paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. Jamie Dimon, before the crisis, was a mid-level guy in America. Now he's a billionaire from committing serial fraud. And they've been, had to face the music many, many times. So I don't understand why they're singling out Mexico. It seems like crime pays.
Well, this is a local think tank, and they're looking around and wondering why it's the first year in a decade that the economy, the GDP, has shrank. And they're saying, well, perhaps if we cut down on all these headlines and these stories of cartels beheading people. But you're mentioning that there is a crime wave that goes on in America, and perhaps if we got rid of all the Jamie Dimons taking all the money, perhaps, remember the velocity of money chart we showed, perhaps there would be more velocity of money. But just in terms of ending that crime, if you end the crime, end the violent crime on the streets, what is there in the world except for a fiat system and financialization? So we've also covered that, like with Boeing or Union Pacific, all these normal manufacturing sort of jobs that are supposed to build things. All they do is extract and then destroy, and they don't invest in the economy. Here, this guy is saying, well, if we just get rid of the violent crime, then people are going to invest here. But nobody invests. It's all speculation and financialization and hollowing out of assets.
And remember, during the 2008 liquidity crisis, when credit froze, the only actual money available for banks to keep the lights on came from Mexican drug cartels.
It was partly Mexican drug cartels and Italian mafia. Yes, they did say that, and we covered that with the UN itself. Their organized crime division said that that was the money flowing, especially through Europe. But again, obviously getting rid of crime and violent crime is certainly a very good thing. Tens of thousands of people are murdered every single year here. Of course, there are several big banks, we won't mention them, that have paid fines for participating in financing and laundering money for those gangs. But speaking of crimes, I want to turn back to the United States, because Lloyd Blankfein has been in the news intervening in the elections. These two tweets are just a great story about all that is America right now leading into this election, where the dons of these mafias run everything, like the Lloyd Blankfeins, and they think that everybody else is a deplorable. So he said, if Democrats go on to nominate Sanders, the Russians will have to reconsider who to work for to best screw up the U.S. Sanders is just as polarizing as Trump, and he'll ruin our economy and doesn't care about our military. If I'm Russian, I go with Sanders this time around. He has the nerve to say that it is Sanders who will ruin the economy, not my credit default swaps. And remember, there were emails that went on in Goldman Sachs where they knew for a fact that those mortgage-backed securities they were selling to grannies, to pensioners, they knew for a fact they were sacks of bleep, and they said it so they defrauded, they stole from these old women. That crashed the economy. The wide-scale fraud crashed the economy.
Right, Lloyd Blankfein over at Goldman Sachs, when he was running the place, they knowingly created securities that had no no value whatsoever in the secondary market. They were synthetic securities that they got caught peddling to their own customers. And then they made negative bets against their own customers, knowing that when their customers realized that they had been sold these synthetic non-entity securities, that they would be in financial trouble. And so they shorted those companies. And they made money on the collapse of the companies who they sold the stuff that caused the collapse of the companies. That's number one. So Lloyd Blankfein is in no moral position to lecture anybody about anything. Furthermore, this whole business about blaming Russians by Americans is getting really pathetic, because here's a guy who's effectively trying to dehumanize a whole group of people, Slavic people in this case. This is remarkably ironic coming from Lloyd Blankfein.
Let's go back to his tweet, because again, he said that Sanders doesn't care about the military, but again, Goldman Sachs pays less than 12% tax rate. Lloyd Blankfein himself, I don't know what he pays, but I'm sure we know for a fact, according to the IRS, that the billionaires pay less taxes than the working class. There are loads of people in America who are the elite. They pay very little taxes relative to everybody else, but they love spending our money on military and big wars and budgets like that. So again, I'm going to turn to another tweet response to this from Chris Arnaud. He's written an amazing book about the deplorables, traveling across America, talking to deplorable people that are outside the front row class, the people like Lloyd Blankfein and Hillary Clinton and everybody on MSNBC. And he used to be a banker, and I'm not sure if it was at Goldman Sachs, but it was one of the Wall Street banks there. If I'm Russian, I would go with hawking synthetic CDOs to blow up the U.S. economy and screw over homeowners. Like, this is so obvious, it should be so transparent, that the fact that Lloyd Blankfein gets put on CNN or MSNBC to say this sort of stuff, to propagandize the Americans and confuse them and divert them from the fact that he himself helped destroy the economy, is remarkable. And the deplorables, I think, know that he's the one more responsible than anybody else in the world. And they remember that our founding fathers said that the destruction of America would come from within, never from without. And these are the people from within who have imploded the economy.
Don't forget, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America sent in a whole brigade of Wall Street bankers to neoliberalize the economy and created a whole new class of kleptocratic oligarchs that have now, under the current administration, it's taken almost 20 years to fix that problem that was pretty much created by American bankers.
There's one thing to just say, okay, we need to stop crime, and you do need to stop crime, but there has to be a plan as well, and it can't just be to let in these American bankers who are going to financialize and hollow out your economy. Chris Arnaud then continues, there is probably no single event more responsible for current voter discontent than the financial crisis and TARP, and Lloyd was right there at the center of it. Amazing. Like, he's pointing out that Lloyd Blankfein was way more responsible for Trump being elected than anybody else. Any meme, there is no weaponized meme that could possibly do more than what Lloyd Blankfein did with the collapse of the economy. He's also paying Hillary Clinton $500,000 to give one of the most tedious, boring speeches in the history of American speech giving. And she got paid $500,000 twice for 2 speeches to Goldman Sachs. So again, he helped her lose. That was part of the many reasons why she lost, many, many reasons for her humiliating loss against Trump.
Pre-crisis, Goldman Sachs took advantage of a system that allowed for rampant insider trading and market manipulation. Then they got caught on the short side of the market and were facing collapse, so they decided to become a regular bank overnight and get all the protections of a regular bank overnight and get a bailout overnight from the likes of the American taxpayer.
Remember, it was Hank Paulson, who had been the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and they mentioned TARP. He gave them inside information that TARP was coming, so they got to front run that, and that's why Lloyd Blankfein became a billionaire for running the utility of a bank. Goldman Sachs is now a bank, not a hedge fund, essentially. But again, talking about this, them trying to propagandize the Americans, that it's not us, the elite. We the elite, haven't destroyed the economy. It must be somebody out there, thousands and thousands of miles away, who doesn't speak English, but he has weaponized memes, that he's the one doing this. Here's a final tweet here about the Gallup poll. Gallup, 60% of Americans say they are better off now than when Trump took office, compared to just 36% who say they are not. That is higher than during the re-election campaigns of Obama, George W. Bush, Clinton, or H.W. Bush. 60% of independents say they're better off than 3 years ago. When this fact happens, when Trump wins re-election, Lloyd Blankfein will say that he had nothing to do with this, that it's somebody else. He'll find some reason, and they'll be the ones on the television not understanding why they lost and that the economy is still destroyed because the crime wave was not stopped. Just like the think tank said about Mexico that we need to stop the crime, well, they haven't stopped the crime in America, and we'll continue to get these populists that the elite don't like.
Yeah, Lloyd Blankfein. Stop trying to dehumanize your fellow Americans. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to John Ackerman. You know, we're in Mexico City, so of course we would check in with John Ackerman. John Ackerman, let's just get a kind of a 30,000-foot look down into what's the politics now. You've got a new leader. What's happening?
Welcome back to Mexico, Max.
Oh, my pleasure. I couldn't, stay away from the ant larvae that long.
Yeah, and you know, I'm your man in Mexico, so
what? You're my man in Mexico.
So you know, you got to pass me the information, that secret information that you've brought from me from Moscow, right?
Yeah, I've got his whole secret cache of information about how to make the best borscht like you've never tasted.
Did you see the recent news that the real Russian agent in Mexico turns out to be Emilio Lozoya?
Tell me about
it. He was the head of Pemex. He was the head of Pemex from Enrique Peña Nieto, corrupt head of Pemex. Took in over $9 million in bribes from Odebrecht. And when the new government came in, started to investigate him, he escaped, went to Moscow first, and then they discovered him in, I think, Malaga, the island of Malaga. And so this is a very important achievement of the new government in terms of bringing accountability, because the Pemex oil company has been a very central part of Mexican national economy, but it also has been a source of incredible corruption, specifically in the previous government. So
I'm glad that I'm glad that you were able to root this bad actor out. And the Kremlin's very happy too. That finally there's a government in Mexico that's willing to step in and root out these bad actors.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. John, you and your government is doing great. What else is this new government doing?
The new government is trying to put back on its feet the Mexican economy, because it's been neoliberalism is really taking its toll.
So what's taking the place
about
of
30
neoliberalism?
years. Post-neoliberalism.
It's post-neoliberalism?
We don't know quite what it is yet. But
you're not sure what it is. What does it most look like? What's similar to?
Look, it's fascinating because Mexico really arrived late to this progressive wave which hit South America. Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil had this pink wave, and Mexico was just in the same old. And all of a sudden, when those countries are going back to the right, now all of a sudden Mexico has turned left, and Argentina as well. And so what Mexico's trying to do right now is, really sort of pick up the pieces first. This case of corruption in Pemex is not the only case. The corruption during the previous government was just out of hand, so we need to sort of recuperate the power of the government to regulate the economy. López Obrador has said that what he wants to do is repeat what Benito Juárez did in the 19th century. Benito Juárez separated church and state. Really radical. Mexico probably has the most radical separation between church and state, even more than France. And now what López Obrador wants to do is separate public and private. Respect the private sector, but recuperate the honesty and the integrity of the public sector. That's his central project.
And this new deal that's been worked out, the USMCA, took the place of NAFTA. Is this a factor? Is it a significant factor?
It's very interesting because historically the left was very much against NAFTA, right? This free trade agreement, which is actually in the favor of the transnational corporations to have free exploitation of the different countries. But NAFTA is now so old. It was passed in 92, 93, came into effect in 94. It's now been there for so long that it really has integrated the two economies in a subordinate way. Mexico, of course, has been an exploitation of Mexico by the United States, but they're so interlinked, the economies now, for López Obrador to come in now and say, no, we want to end NAFTA, would have been really irresponsible, would have sent our economy into a tail dive. and nosedive, and it would have really made it much more difficult for López Obrador to do his social programs, because that's the other side. In addition to combating corruption, he's, now like 10 million new scholarships being handed out throughout the country to old people, to students, to indigenous people, to most of the marginalized sectors. And so what he has said is, well, let's rethink NAFTA. He's worked on this new agreement, which was actually worked on mostly by the Peña Nieto administration, but he respected those agreements. And basically in the negotiations, the Mexican government stopped Trump from turning this into a worse agreement for Mexico. It's still, from my personal point of view, continues to privilege the United States corporations and economy over Mexico. It continues to privilege the big corporations over the working class. But for instance, there's been a side effect, very positive side effect, in that Mexico has been forced to pass a new labor legislation, reform its constitution actually, to be accepted by the labor unions in the United States. This new agreement. And this has actually created a new scenario for free and fair elections within the unions in Mexico, something we haven't had for a long time. And so this might create, a new wave of labor activism and strength of the working class in Mexico, which could be a very good secondary effect of the TEMEC.
Right. Now, you mentioned an interesting cycle there a moment ago. You're saying that in Latin America, you had a move to the left in various countries, Bolivia and others. And now that they've gone, and Mexico is somewhat static, and now they've gone right. Certainly in Brazil, they've got a new, what you could call right-wing leadership there. And that Mexico is now embraced a leftist government. But this is kind of a cycle in Latin America we've seen a long time. It goes from the hard right to the hard left, back and forth for a long, long time. The left comes into power, a lot of money is printed, social programs are enacted, and people get fed up because they feel like there needs to be a return to some kind of work ethic, and so they bring in a hardliner, and then the hardliner is too hard. And this cycle seems to be repeating in Latin America for decades and decades. Is this just another chapter in that cycle, or is this different this time, John?
I think it's different. López Obrador is a wise man. I'm not just because I support him. If you actually look at what he's doing, he's learned from these experiences. He hasn't been irresponsible fiscally or even monetarily. He's not printing money, as you said. His inflation is actually lower now than it was with Peña Nieto. The guys who printed the money, the real populists, the irresponsible ones, were the priistas, were the neoliberals, because they need all this extra cash to buy votes, right? Because they didn't have political legitimacy. López Obrador, who has political legitimacy, 71% support, doesn't have to do that.
This idea of socialism, because in America and in Peña Nieto, there was like corporate socialism. There's money printing that goes to the corporations, the top corporations. And then there's this populist socialism where money printing goes to social programs, et cetera. And so, but nevertheless, neither one of these seems to work. It doesn't work in the United States either. We now have an entrenched kleptocracy in the United States. And it's a lot of money printing, and they want to print more money, and the debts keep rising. So in the current government in Mexico, it seems that why not just a return to sound money?
That's what's happening. I mean, that's why I said López Obrador is very wise. He's been very pragmatic and responsible in this area. He's not, the peso has actually strengthened. There's no inflation. Well, the inflation has less inflation than before. And the way in which he's getting money for his social programs is, one, what he calls Republican austerity. He's taken back the name of austerity. Austerity was used by the neoliberals as a mask to cover up, taking away social programs, right? It wasn't really austerity. Austerity, what is austerity? Being austere is being, without privileges, being humble, being honest. And so he's recuperating that original idea of austerity. So he's cutting back at government, but not government social programs. The increase in social programs and cutting back at government bureaucracy. It's incredible how the neoliberals, who are supposedly against the state, ballooned, created all sorts of different new public officials, hired up their friends and their family members to do nothing. And so he's cutting out at that. He's ending tax evasion, right? He's not increasing taxes, interestingly enough. He doesn't talk about
taxes are not being increased.
He's not increasing. He's promised to not increase taxes, but just to increase tax evasion, because Mexico, we only bring in about 17%, 18% of GDP for public income, and of that, 5-6% is from Pemex. So really taxes is like 13%, 14%, and on the books they're much higher. So if you actually just charge fiscal paradises, right, tax evasion, you can actually bring up this income, and that's what's happening. Just a few days ago, López Obrador had a big dinner, right, in the National Palace with big businessmen, in which he invited them to contribute voluntarily, for instance, to pay off this incredibly ostentatious, ridiculous airplane, which had been purchased by Calderón and Peña Nieto, which nobody even wants to buy in the market because it's so ridiculously ostentatious. So he came up with a special plan of issuing lottery tickets, and he's getting the wealthiest oligarchs of Mexico to chip in with millions of dollars for that. So he's finding other ways to bring in the money without falling into these other strategies of other governments in the past.
All right, so to break the cycle that we were talking about there, so the top wealth feels like they're getting squeezed, and then they become very active, politically active.
Aggressive.
And all kinds of nefarious things happen, bad things happen.
Gene Sharp strategies, for instance, right? The soft attacks on regimes, right?
So he feels, you feel, and I guess he feels that there is a way to wind your way through this and get oligarchs on board to some degree. Okay, now, I mean, just broadly speaking, this was kind of what Putin faced when he took over in the Russian Federation, is he had to demasculate the oligarchs, but in the same, without actually throwing the country into greater chaos.
Exactly.
So here we are almost 20 years later, and you have GDP is up, you have life expectancy is up, the social metrics of social well-being are higher. And so is that a model? I mean, would you look at that as a model?
That's a good point.
Is Putin a model?
I don't know.
How do you like that for trolling the global media?
Putin has done a great job of having his population behind him as well, right? He has a very high popular approval rating. López Obrador does well, 71% support López Obrador today. I think this is,
but it's very different.
Ways,
okay, Obrador is definitely a touchy-feely guy that takes economy class, and he's like a Furby doll of politicians, you know. Whereas Putin obviously has a persona that is the man on the horse, kind of riding in and taking charge, and it's a different persona, but the objectives seem to be the same.
Well, I wouldn't say that Russia is the model for Mexico, but I do think that there's new space for experimentation today in the world, right? The really existing communism ended a long time ago, 30 years, right? The fall of the Berlin Wall. But now the option of neoliberal capitalism is also dead. I mean, Trump has just sunk any idea that the United States or neoliberalism could be an example for anything. You don't get growth, you don't get equality, you don't get peace. You know.
It was dead before he took office. Right.
So,
and he's been
his idea, right? But and so there's a real fascinating space for creating new alternatives. I think that López Obrador is turning into, even though he's not traveling all around the world trying to go to the big Geneva and the big international forums. I think that what we're doing in Mexico is setting an international example.
You're a smart guy.
No?
You're in the media. Do you know what talent land is?
Talent land. I've never heard of,
See,
not Disneyland.
70,000 people from all over Latin America getting together in Guadalajara for a tech and media boom camp for days, and this is where this is the future. This is where the next growth is going to come from. This generation. So this is like a Woodstock meets a Microsoft campus, right? I mean,
sounds wonderful.
It's huge, right? I mean, this is the type of thing that what I would think.
And which corporations control the meeting?
It's totally decentralized.
Yeah?
You have hundreds and hundreds of sponsors, but it's mostly user generated, user put forward. We'll be there. We'll be speaking there, and talking about what we always talk about: the return of hard money, sound money, Bitcoin. Which now have you come around to have a more positive view on Bitcoin? I think you've been somewhat lukewarm on the idea.
It's not something I follow too carefully. All I know about Bitcoin is from Max Keiser. So,
Really?
So that means that
So
I
you
have to
own
be
a lot of it, right?
pro-Bitcoin.
That's
I don't own any of
$5.
it. No, you haven't convinced me to
Unlike
buy it
Peter
yet.
Schiff, that
I'm
never
first
bought
gonna
any.
I'm first gonna buy a lottery ticket for the airplane, the president's airplane in Mexico.
Right.
That's my first investment. But you might convince me.
All right. It'll look even better at 100,000 a coin than it does now at 10,000.
How much money have you made off of Bitcoin, Max?
An incalculable amount. It's unbelievable.
So why don't you buy the presidential airplane?
I try not to be ostentatious, but I did think about it. I was going to put
because
a bid on
he's offered it to Trump, he's offered it to Justin Trudeau, he's offered it to the heads of Saudi Arabia, and no one wanted
I think
it because
they wanted 125 million. I put in a bid at 80.
Exactly. But that's like peanuts for you, right?
Yeah, but I never. I like a good deal though. Like anybody with wealth, I don't like to overpay.
Right.
John, we got to go, but thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much, Max. An honor as always to be on with you.
You're our best guy. You're a man of Mexico. How could we not see you? Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, John Ackerman. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.